Okay, we are beginning today the 14th letter in the Iggeres HaKodesh, and we're going to look at a pasuk in Sefer Devarim for a moment, which will become one of the main themes of this chapter. So if you look here in Sefer Devarim, chapter 11, verse 12, it speaks about Eretz Yisrael, and it calls it Eretz, the land, Asher, that, Hashem Elokecha, God your God, Doiresh Oisa, he looks into it or he looks after it. Eine Hashem Elekechaba, the eyes of Hashem are there. Mereishis Hashana, from the beginning of the year. And I want you to notice here the way the word Mereishis is spelled, which is an unusual spelling. Commonly, there would be an aleph between the resh and the shin, like the first word of the Torah is Bereshis, and that's not a typo, that this aleph is missing. But Mireshis Hashanah, from the beginning of the year, Vi'ad until Achris Hashanah, till the end of the year. So a couple of points that are going to jump out, and we're going to talk about them. One is, why is this aleph missing? Why does it say Mireshis and not Mireshis with an aleph, like Bereshis? Second of all, here it says that Hashem investigates or looks after the world in the English always. And then it says from the beginning of the year until the end of the year. Well, if it's always, it's always. What does it mean when it says the beginning of the year to the end of the year? What happens at the end of the year? So again, always and beginning of the year and the end of the year seem to be either the same or different. In either way, it's a question. Why are you saying the same thing twice, or why are you saying two different things? So we're going to file that in the back of our minds, and we'll come back to it, a little bit later on in the parak. So here we go. So this chapter or letter was written after 1792, and the indication there is that in 1788, on the 2nd of Iyar, which later became the birthday of the Reb Marash, but on the 2nd of Iyar, Reb Mendel Vitebsker, who was one of the Chassidim who led the pilgrimage that established the first Chabad community in Eretz Yisrael, for which many of these letters are an appeal to support the Chabad communities, the Kollel Chabad, which goes on to this very day. It's still one of the largest distributors of social services in Eretz Yisrael. They do the bar mitzvahs for war orphans, and this isn't an appeal for them, but it's a good tzedakah. And just to throw in, everybody gives tzedakah every day. When did the Rebbe give his tzedakah? When the Rebbe would go to the oil, he would give tzedakah to Kollel Chabad. Now, as we all know, just from life experience, there's an excitement and then things wane. And the question isn't how enthusiastic are we on the first mile or on the last mile, but in the middle mile, where are we there? And apparently, this couple of years after the passing of Mendel Vitebsker had led to a little bit of a waning of the enthusiasm for the support of the Kollel Chabad in Eretz Yisrael. Now, we're talking 1792 in Russia. It's not like the people were living high on the hog, as we say. These were already people who were struggling. And of course, there were a lot of local needs, but the distinctive characteristic of giving tzedakah to Eretz Yisrael, which again has come to the fore of our awareness, always has a predominance and a dominance. And so the Alter Rebbe wrote this letter as a method not only to encourage people to be more supportive or to reawaken their support that may have waned for Eretz Yisrael. Here, because the Alter Rebbe has already spoken about the significance of tzedakah and how tzedakah is sort of the avodah of our time at many levels. Here, the Alter Rebbe is going to speak about specifically the value of tzedakah of Eretz Yisrael and that character, and the necessity to bring an invigoration into, again, here it's tzedakah, but by extrapolation, all of our mitzvahs. One of the things which the Alter Rebbe really speaks pretty significantly about in the Sefer Shel Beinanim is the pushback against doldrums, against routine, against, I don't know, we do what we do because we just do it. And the constant need for invigoration and innovation and creativity and not being just predictable and going along doing what we do because, I don't know, we go along and do what we do. And to constantly bring this in. And again, you can sort of see that as the path that we're taking to understanding why it describes Hashem's relationship with Eretz Yisrael as being from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, because there needs to be a reconfiguration, a reanalysis at the end of the year and make sure that it goes forward. And as you can imagine, we talk about this a lot around Rosh Hashanah time, how there has to be a reconfiguration of our relationship and a launching to go forward. So the Alter Rebbe begins this letter with the express statement, Lo oirer es ha'ava ha'yeshena v'chibas eretz HaKodesh liyois bayeres kerish be'esh mikerev ish belev amuk ki'ilu hayoy mamish nosan Hashem ruchai aleinu ruach nediva v'snadev am l'malos yodam Hashem biad malaya v'rechava b'riboy achariboy. Okay, it's a lot of words. Let's go back and say what they mean and what we can learn from them. So the Alter Rebbe lays out very clearly that his objective here is to re-kickstart, reinvigorate, reawaken that old-time love. This term called Ava Hayashana, this old love, and we'll talk about what old love means, and this warmth, this embrace of Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, and you see how the Alter refers to it. Now, again, obviously in 1792, this was not a political entity on the map of the nations of the world, and we're certainly not appealing here only for the political reality of this national identity, but to something called Eretz HaKodesh, which we will, of course, delve into and talk about in some detail, so that it should flame up. And this word Boeres carries a connotation of this raging flame, like a fiery flame that comes from within the person. And as we have pointed out so many times, that the different names for human beings, here the Alter Rebbe chooses the name Ish, Ish meaning the emotional character, in contrast, for example, to Adam, which means the intellectual. Enosh and Gever and so on, the different names that we have. So the Alter Rebbe is directly appealing to an emotional excitement that comes from the depths of the heart. And how do we do that? That we will see it as if Hayoim, today, we'll talk about that, Mamish, and we know that emphatic term, Hashem is giving his spirit upon us, this devoted spirit, to devote the people to fulfill with their hands or fill their hands to Hashem from their full and broad hand with abundance upon abundance, year by year, continuously growing above. Now, what's going on here? So the Alter Rebbe is reaching out to Bnei Yisrael, to the community, and he wants to stir them up to be generous in their gift to Eretz Yisrael. So you might think, well, he'll take out a brochure, he'll show them all the wonderful things that the Kehillah Chabad is doing. He'll talk about the need. He'll talk about the struggles of the time, which were very, very significant. And this will stimulate the people to be generous and to be giving and to be forthcoming financially. But that's not the tact which he takes. Instead, the tact which the Alter Rebbe takes here is to spiritualize the relationship between the people and their understanding of their financial resources and their connection with Eretz Yisrael. Not even necessarily, or obviously it includes the people, or it's primarily focused to the people who are living there. But he doesn't make the appeal to be towards the people. Although he does that in other times where he says, where should a brother turn if not to his own brother? Here he makes it to the distinctive characteristic of living in Eretz Yisrael and of the settling of the land. And this is 1792. So try to we use the best imagination we can as to what that looked like in that type of circumstance. So the Alter Rebbe is trying to, again, arouse it, that it should be as fiery as a flame. Now, in the previous letter, we talked about changing our perspective of tzedakah from just being a financial obligation to being a spiritual obligation. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is really doing here. He is spiritualizing the relationship between the people in Eretz Yisrael. He's not simply speaking about their financial obligations. He's not simply speaking about their social obligation. He's tying it to the infinity of their spirituality. Now, again, he's not just talking about some nostalgic sense of love for Eretz Yisrael, but about the current relationship. And again, this is where we're going to be really hammering home. You see here, he notes that Hashem has given us, and this is a common term. Of course, every morning we say in the davening, Elokai, my God, Neshama, the soul, Shenasata be, that you have given me today, not just the soul that I got when I was born. The blessing that we say every morning for the mitzvah of Torah study, we say, Blessed are you, Hashem, Nosein HaTorah, who gives, the giver of Torah, not Nosan HaTorah, who gave us the Torah 3,300 years ago, but Nosein HaTorah, he is giving it to us today. Nostalgia can be meaningful, it can be emotional. It's not a plan for inspiration for the future. And we know that this is a sort of common tug of war in the Jewish world. There are those who certainly want to take the tact of saying, oh, the good old days. Remember how everything used to be great? We had malaria and polio. Remember how great life used to be? And then, you talk about that. We're wistful for recreating the good old days. And then there are those who say the good old days weren't always so good. And our goal is to make the future, Yiddishkeit's best days are in the future, because we run the risk of essentially creating a mentality that says the best days have passed. So who wants to join something when they've come in at the end of the high? So a bunch of people talking about what it used to be like. That's not invigorating, inspiring, and so on. And again, obviously, my bias acknowledged, this is one of the Rebbe's very strong tacks, is to empower young people. And that young people, even kids with Sivas Hashem and so on, should be invigorated. So this is a little bit what the Alter Rebbe is trying to talk about. We're not just talking about, the good old days and how it used to be and that initial inspiration and how enthusiastic we were. We're talking about the going forward level. We're talking about the pushing ahead level. That's what we're talking about here. That our love for Eretz Yisrael is a gift which Hashem is constantly giving us, and we should respond in kind. So back in the text, midei shana b'shana, every year in its way of the year. And this is really going to be the answer to that question about why it says from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, that we don't just want to keep on doing the same old, same old. That's not inspiring. I mean, we know this, just to use a financial example. The dollar I made last year is going to likely be worth less than the dollar I make this year. So there's got to be this constant, this continuous increase, this continuous expanse, this continuous change, and not just more of the same old, because the same old becomes less valuable every year. That continuously elevates above, that follows the pattern of Hashem, that just as Hashem is constantly giving, so too we should be constantly giving, again, spiritualizing our relationship with Eretz Yisrael. Hameir Eretz HaKodesh, that radiates into the Holy Land. Hamischadesh umisraba tomid, that is constantly renewed that is constantly increasing. Kidichsiv, like it says, and this is the pasuk, Tamid, which really, the way the Alter Rebbe quotes it here, is one of those creative forms of quoting, because as we saw, the word Tamid really belongs to the previous clause. Eine Hashem elekecha ba, the eyes of Hashem are there. Mereishis Hashana, and that's that quote unquote misspelling, although obviously that's not a mistake, from the beginning of the year, Viad Achris Shana, until the end of the year. So again, just to emphasize how the Alter Rebbe is reading this pasuk, I want to go back to it for a moment. If you note here, in the pasuk, Eretz Asher Hashem Lekecha Derish Eisei Tamid, pause. So at this point, there really is like a comma. The land that the land that God your God inquires about constantly, comma, the eyes of Hashem, your God, are there from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. But the Alter Rebbe reads it as Tamid Einei Hashem Lekecha ba, constantly are the eyes of Hashem there from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. You had a question? You have to unmute though, because we can't hear you.
Oops, I'm unmuting. Okay, thanks. I can't find where's the pasuk in the?
It's in Devarim 11:12. Devarim, Deuteronomy 11:12.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
You got it. Okay. So the Alter Rebbe is reading it, as we pointed out, that it's constant. And then yet it says from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Constant, but so which one is it? If it's constant, it's constant. If it's from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, that seems to suggest that at the end of the year, it ends. So again, which one is this? But this is the point that we're going to make. The hive ad achris chulu ain't moving. What do we mean when we say that it goes until the end of the year? That's really where the question is. You know, the sense of fluctuation. Because when one year ends, the next year begins. So back to the beginning. So what in fact does this mean? Seemingly it would have been simpler to simply say forever and ever. Why does Torah say from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, which has some suggestion that there's a conclusion, when of course right after the beginning of the year is right after the end of the year is the beginning of the year. You know, it's like what number comes after 7 is 1, the 7th day of the week, then it's the first day of the week. So at the end of the year, then it's the beginning of the next year. So what is it that the Alter Rebbe, what is it the Alter Rebbe is asking that the pasuk is trying to communicate to us by using this sort of poetic terminology? Okay, so here we go. Acha Inyan, the point being, that is, now we're going to start to describe the way in which Hashem sustains all of life, and then specifically as it relates to Eretz Yisrael. So here we go. Yuvin alpi mashakasa. We have a pasuk. The pasuk is in Koheles, Ecclesiastes 7, chapter 7, verse 12. Koheles 7:12. Hashem b'chachma yisad aretz. Hashem, through chachma, founds the land. Now, we have talked a lot about that the word chachma, which we translate as wisdom or intelligence or something like that. So this pasuk says simply that Hashem is very designed the world, like they call it intelligent design, that the world is founded in a very smart way. And as we often talk about, if the sun was a little closer, we'd all boil. If the sun was a little more distant, we'd freeze, and the soil and replenishing and so on. But now the Alter Rebbe brings a different meaning to this phrase, that Hashem with Chachma. Now, Chachma, as we know, is not just about the quality of the engineering or the brilliance of the poetry. Rather, Chachma means the infinity of Hashem, the koyach ma, the willingness to engage in something greater than itself. This is the idea. Hashem has embedded within the earth the infinity of Hashem. Hashem b'chachma yisad aretz. Meaning, she is said ha'aretz el yaina, that the foundation, the premise of creation, he bechinis mamale kol amin, is memale kol amin. I know that's a term which we're going to come back to in a moment. I just want to finish the sentence. I'm going to come back to explain this term. V'atachtoina he eretz chayfetz, and down here it is the eretz chayfetz. Again, another term which we will come back to. Hamachavenes kenegda mamish v'nikra al shma eretz achayim. That is in perfect alignment with it, and therefore we call it the land of life. Okay, a lot of terms here. Let's go back and let's talk about what they mean. As a general rule, there are two ways in which Hashem interfaces with creation. There is what is called Memale Kol Almin. He fills all worlds, which is the term we use here. And there's another phrase which is called Soivev Kol Almin. He surrounds all worlds, which we'll talk about. The analogy being, the whole body is alive. My hand is alive, thank God. The lungs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the hair, the nose, the teeth, every part of you is alive. Then there is a difference between the life in my hand and the life in every other, in my eyes and nose and teeth. So one is the whole all-encompassing characteristic, and the other is the very particularized. So is an inanimate object any less the creation of Hashem than an animate object? Certainly not. They are all created by Hashem. That level is what we would call Sovev. Sovev translates as surrounds. In Hebrew, a dreidel is a sivivon. It goes round and round. So Sovev is that which surrounds. It surrounds the whole world. Everything is equally within the world. The physical, the spiritual, the most obviously godly, the less obviously godly, and so on. And then, of course, everything needs to be treated individually. So Hashem's the form of godliness which Hashem imparts to one item is going to certainly be different than the form which Hashem imparts to another item. That is called mamale, or you might think of it as the square pegs in the square holes and the round pegs in the round holes. You should treat everybody the same and treat everybody differently. It's true. I mean, we treat everybody with a certain baseline similarity, and then we treat everybody a little differently. So there is, in fact, this absolute distinction between them. Now, this level of Hashem being invested within this physical world is particularly evident when it comes to Eretz Yisrael. This is the part that I want to talk about. We'll get to sort of a little bit the history of it almost and the objective of it, but let's get a little more data here, and then we'll come back to it to talk about the distinctive characteristics. Okay. Hine hu nimshach mi'amshachas va'aris chachma ilah. So this level is drawn down from chachma ilah. Chachma ilah, translation, superior or supernal wisdom. So that does not mean to suggest that this is really well made. The idea is that chachma, which is the infinity, it's the option. That's why the word that I like to translate chachma as is imagination. Because imagination is within the realm of the intellect. It's not something tangible, and it's not just an emotion. And it captures that unlimitedness of the intellect. The idea to imagine the infinite. And of course, your imagination never runs out. We never say, well, you can't imagine anything better than that, or you can't imagine any more because you've run out of your imagination. And like imagination, it doesn't have to conform to the rules of engineering. So wisdom still has to conform somewhat to the realm of the possible and rational and physical. But imagination is not handicapped by that. So when we describe Eretz Yisrael as being Chachma Ilah, we mean it's the most infinite and expansive. And again, we can point to the even modern day sense of the miracles of how Eretz Yisrael survives and how they've transformed it and so on. That's not really where the Alter Rebbe is heading. He's really talking about this ultimate sense of the infinity of Hashem being encased in Eretz Yisrael. So maybe this is the good time to let's back up a half a step and understand what is the role of Eretz Yisrael in Torah, because obviously it's very central, and here how it ties into this letter. So we know that the beginning of Torah is Lech Lecha, or the beginning of the Jewish people is Lech Lecha, that Hashem tells Avram to leave. So if we don't know how the story ends, we might imagine that maybe this is the path of godliness. And again, we're not studying comparative cultures here, but lahavdil, there are those that would say that to be godly is not to be tied to a land, that's the whole distinction, is that every other culture is absolutely linked to its land, and we are not linked to a land. We are going to Lech Lecha, one could imagine. But Hashem immediately dispels that, because where does he tell Avram to Lech Lecha? Not just to go wandering eternally, but El Haaretz Areka, that I will show you, the land that I will show you. So we're not against land, but there's something very different about being linked with the land purely by your birth and culture and history, and going to a land which I will show you. So again, it's the risk of stating the incredibly obvious. The idea of the Jewish people being settled in the land of Israel is absolutely baked into the entirety of creation. The first Rashi, that why does Hashem begin with creation? To emphasize that Hashem created the world to give Eretz Yisrael to the Jewish people. This, though, only further begs the greater question. So why is that? So why Taka? I mean, why is it that the people have to have their land? Is it simply because you have to have a place to live? And if you have to have a place to live, the fact that we all live together, whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or it's in Jews forming communities throughout the diaspora, there's simply a place that's our place and everybody gathers together there? Or is there some deeper, more significant concept that is baked into the very fabric of the story of creation? And of course, the answer is B. That's the whole sort of objective, which is the absolute blending of the physical and the spiritual. Meaning, were we to take the position that, again, you can imagine, that Hashem is coming to Avram and uprooting him from his homeland, because there is no such concept of a homeland, that being aligned with Hashem means that you are forever aligned only with the spiritual. That's your identity. And having a land is almost counterintuitive to the concept of it. Like, I mean, even historically in other cultures, they talk about cities being a form of rebellion because they're not trusting in God and they are locking themselves in. And whereas when they're wanderers and farmers, they have this sort of great trust in godliness, and there's some romantic sense that they've put their faith in something greater than real estate and the local authorities. But that's not the idea. And again, not simply because as a matter of practicality that we have to have somewhere to call home. It's that innate within the objective of illustrating the non-conflict between the material and the spiritual. There is Hashem's presence in all of the world, and then there is a particular quality of Eretz Yisrael. You know, every day is holy. Yom Kippur is still holier. Every place God can be found in every spot, and then there's still a distinctive characteristic to Eretz Yisrael. There still is something special about Hashem's relationship with Eretz Yisrael. And this is what we're describing, not simply because we live there, it predates our living there. That's why Hashem brings Avram there. Meaning, we could imagine, again, a different scenario where Hashem says to Avram, the land that you're in, we're going to make that the Holy Land because you're there. Rather, by taking Avram out of that land and bringing him to Eretz Yisrael, Hashem is describing that Eretz Yisrael contains this distinctive Kedusha that draws the people to it, that sort of magnetically brings them there. And then even to Yerushalayim, and that's where Hashem directs Abraham to bring his son to the Akedah, et cetera, et cetera. Just to finish that thought for one moment, The Rambam tells us that the spot where Hashem tells us to build the Beis Hamikdash is the same spot where Avram brought Yitzchak to the Akedah, where Noach brought his sacrifice, and where Adam was created. So the Rebbe explains that don't get misunderstand. You might think, oh, well, that's why Hashem told us to build the Mizbeach there, because of all these great historical events which occurred on that spot. And no, it's the opposite. That since this spot has such an innate characteristic of Kedusha, that's why that's where Adam was created, Noach brought a sacrifice, Yitzchak was brought for the Akedah, and ultimately that's where the Mizbeach will be brought. Meaning the sanctity of that, of Yerushalayim, and that spot in the Beis HaMikdash, predates any of these other events. And that's why they are drawn to it. And that's what we're saying here. The Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is embedded in its creation, because, again, it is created with the Chachma Ilah, this most expansive quality of godliness. And that's what V'nikra al Shma, back in the text, Eretz HaChaim. That's why it is called the land of life. That because it is that idea of life, just like a tree has to constantly draw on the soil, or a person needs constant nourishment. All of creation is constantly being nourished by the infinity of Hashem that is, again, embedded naturally in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And again, it is drawing on it like the nurturing of a tree from the soil, or a person from food, or whatever. It is drawing on it from this level of godliness that is embedded in that identity. Meaning, the most seemingly conflicting aspect to godliness is earth. Meaning, when Hashem creates the world, now there is opposition to godliness. Because when I walk into the world, I feel the physicality. It's harder to imagine the infinity of Hashem. So the most conflicted aspect of creation is the physical earth. So when we can demonstrate that the physical earth is in concert with the infinity of Hashem, then we have truly illustrated the infinity of Hashem's presence, the chachma of Hashem, because that God exists in the intellect and the academic is also resounding, but it's a little more imaginable. That God exists within the human, a little more so. That God exists within the animal, it's a little more difficult, within the tree. The most difficult is to imagine that God exists in the soil. So where do we get a little bit of a break? Where do we get a little bit of a sense that the soil itself is godly in Eretz Yisrael? By using this analogy that just as the soil, which seems to be of a lesser quality than the vegetable, because the vegetable, at least it grows, and yet what gives the vegetable the power to grow is the minerals in the soil. So here's something that, again, appears to be less godly, the soil, because it doesn't even move. It doesn't even have any sign of life. And yet it nourishes the vegetable, which nourishes the animal, which nourishes the person, which nourishes Hashem, and round and round. So so you're telling me to accept that. Fine. And that's why, in a certain sense, the farmer, we'll see this point made here as well, the farmer is innately a little bit more aligned with his spirituality. Because he sees the inability of mankind. For all our technology, if it don't rain, you got problems. And again, we're just trying to replicate the natural ability of the soil to nurture the vegetable, etc. So can you give us a break? Like, can we get some sense of this? Yes, that's what Eretz Yisrael is. That Eretz Yisrael nurtures the entire world, because the godliness there, just in the physicality, is more obvious because that level of godliness, that level of creation has a godliness that comes from, again, chachma ilah, this most expansive, I like the word imagination, if you like a different word, the most expansive characteristic of godliness is baked into that level. So we continue. Like it says, now I made a mistake before. I told you the other pasuk was from Koheles 7:12. It's this pasuk that's from Koheles 7:12 that says chachma, and again, chachma not just meaning genius or wisdom, but the infinity of Hashem is what gives life to its host. Hashem embeds himself in chachma, and from there to all of creation, and the pinnacle of that is in Eretz Yisrael. And from there, it sort of withers down to other levels. And that's why everything about our identity is always focused. All the davening, return us to the land, rebuild the land, facing towards Eretz Yisrael, and so on, because there's a spiritual characteristic, as Yaakov Avinu said when he had the dream of the ladder, which also took place in the place of the Mizbeach. This is the gate to heaven. And it's not just because we created it in our own minds. I mean, we know that historically, I'm talking about even going back, 2,000 years ago, there were attempts to sort of recreate a concept of Yerushalayim outside of Yerushalayim and build a Beis Hamikdash in other places and so on. But it just doesn't work. It's like trying to make Shabbos on Wednesday. I mean, seemingly it should work. Why not? We'll all decide to get together and get dressed in our best clothing and light candles and put out the white tablecloth and so on Tuesday night. And there have been such attempts, but it just doesn't work because it's innate, just like in space, in creation, in geography, the space of Eretz Yisrael. Similarly, in time, it's not just that everybody's agreed that we're not going to go to work one day out of the week. It's something particular about Shabbos that we can tap into, but we can't create. And in a similar sense with Eretz Yisrael, it's something we can tap into, but we can't create. Okay, so we continue. We say, "V'arav amshachazoi he mischadeshes bor chodesh mamish b'chol shana v'shana." This distinctive characteristic that godliness is a little more or a lot more tangible in the physical environment of Eretz Yisrael is something that is renewed every year. Now, as we talk about, it's very current with the Parshas, the primary distinction to Mitzrayim, which is held up as sort of the anti-Eretz Yisrael, is the Nile River. So whenever there's famine, Egypt has food. Why does Egypt have food? Because they have the Nile River. They have the greatest natural resource in the whole world. They had 3 harvest seasons. And as such, they were insulated from famine because they weren't dependent on rain. And every other part of the world, every other country in that part of the world is dependent on rain. So if there's a drought, they're stuck. But Mitzrayim is less stuck. And that's why Mitzrayim always has food. Now we find a somewhat similar idea with the snake. If you recall from the story of creation, that Hashem curses the snake, and he says to the snake, "You'll crawl on your belly and you'll eat dust." And Chazal asked the question, why is that a curse? Seemingly, that's a blessing. If your food is dust, you'll never go hungry. What does an animal do all day? It looks for food. I mean, ultimately, we could argue, what does a human being do all day? We look for food. Imagine if we could eat dust. So we would be able, all that resource that we put into eating food would be able to be reallocated somewhere else. So we explain, yeah, but that's the problem. The problem with the snake is that he has everything, and that's it. He has no yearning. There is no longing. And while we may think that the ultimate objective in life is to not need nothing from nobody, we argue that need, not being needy, but need is a great virtue. It drives a person to accomplish more, to be more intensely connected with Hashem, with other people, creativity. And this idea that all I want to do is sit on the couch is not healthy for the person, and it's not even pleasurable. And that's why the snake crawls on its belly, because it never looks up to the infinity of Hashem. And sometimes it's, I don't want to know about it. I just want to know about the right here and now. I don't want to hear about something beyond this moment. Well, Eretz Yisrael is in a way the same thing. We all know the jokes, how come the Jews got the one part of that land that doesn't have oil, it doesn't have, because it allows us to be connected with the infinity of Hashem. Even though it feels like need, and need sometimes feels like weakness, truly, though, the idea that I have a passionate need is something that much greater than I am able to reach out to the infinity of Hashem. So all the other lands, or Egypt, which is held up as the anti-Eretz Yisrael, I don't need nothing from nobody. And there's a certain comfort there. And when there's famine, people go there. Concurrently, it becomes a place devoid of godliness and thus devoid of this reaching out and so on. So too, the fact that we are not just on an infinite cycle, and that every year we have to reestablish our relationship with Hashem. On the one hand, it feels like, well, what do you mean? Don't you know who I am? It's like a kid shows up, let's say, in camp or a new school. So on the one hand, they have a total blank slate. So the fact that last year or in previous times they were immature or childish or failed doesn't get carried over with them. People don't know their failing, but they also don't know their accomplishments, and they have to, as we would say, prove themselves all over again. They have to start from the beginning and once again attempt to establish their identity, and they don't get to just rest on their previous accomplishments and glide based on what they've already done. And as we know, that when you try to glide on what you've already done, you get bypassed by someone who's out there. I mean, you think about companies, AOL and BlackBerry and so on, which ran the world. And in a minute, what happened? General Motors. And then all of a sudden, they were bypassed. And it was what I do. I keep doing what I've been doing, right? You keep doing what you've been doing, and you get bypassed by something that's being more innovative. So while it would feel like, wouldn't that just be great if I would, quote, have nothing to do? Hashem, by saying it's only from the beginning of the year until the end of the year, that's saying that every year you have an opportunity to have a more intense, a more significant, a more powerful relationship with Hashem. It's like Hashem has said, this year was good, it's fine, but I'm not willing to do this year again. I mean, a simplistic analogy. When a child finishes a grade in school, why doesn't he just then go do that grade again, and he'll do much better? Because that's it. You finished third grade. Now it's time to move on to the fourth grade. But I'm now I'd be really, really excellent at third grade, right? But now it's time to move on. So this is where the letter continues. The Chachma level is the absolute unification with Hashem. And again, remember that Chachma doesn't mean how smart I am and so on. It means this intensity of the closest thing we can get to infinity in our human experience, which, again, the word I like is imagination. Maybe you have a better word. It's about the capacity to think outside of myself and outside of what I already know. And not simply to say, yeah. So what you're really saying is, and then to tidy it up and put it in a little box, or just take what I already know and make it a little better and just improve. It's about a radical, completely new way of looking at things, so to speak, wild ideas. And as we talked about, in Chachma, we have to be cautious because that includes foolish ideas and so on, but they need to be juried out. And if we're going to force you to jury it out before we even consider it, we'll never get to innovative, wild ideas. Now, it's important to recognize that as a result of Hashem creating the world with this Chachma, every aspect that we call sort of that is beneath Chachma, that is subsequent to Chachma, becomes welcome. Meaning, if Hashem were to create the world, let's imagine, with one specific midah. Let's imagine Hashem creates the world with gevura, with rigid organization, So then, if I'm not a naturally rigorously organized person, then I'm sort of left out. Or if Hashem were to create the world with chesed, with limitless giving, so if I'm a more sort of calculated person, then I would be left out. So Chachma is not only the opportunity for infinite expanse, it also, at a certain personal level, is the opportunity for every aspect of my existence to be aligned with the infinity of Hashem. Even if I have a very particular, which I guess we all have, a very particular character trait, I'm not left out. So again, if we say, well, in order to be in, you have to be all chesed, all generous. And if that's not my nature, so then I feel then I'm left out. But by creating the world with chachma, instead of one particular midah, remember the word midah literally translated as a measured characteristic. So even though chachma is a midah, because it's chachma and it's not analysis, but it's essentially measured by its immeasurability. I know that sounds somewhat contradictory, but conceptually that's the idea. It's not truly infinite because we're defining it, but it is open to every aspect finding its way. So my chachma can influence my chesed, my generosity can influence my gevura, my rigorous orderliness, and so on. This is what the infinity of chachma allows. Yes, you had a question. You got to unmute and
The next the Bina and the Das. Are you going to ever speak about them? Because
we I
it's
mean it's not as directly relevant here because
right.
by emphasizing that it comes from chachma, it opens up every aspect, including bina and das and so on. But again, imagine if Hashem created the world with bina, then if I'm kind of a chachma guy, I'm more artistic than I am organized. I feel, well, I guess I'm left out. If Hashem created with das, which brings the intellect to the character, then again, if I'm not that kind of guy, that or that aspect of my life is kind of a left out. Chachma doesn't leave anything out, and that's one of its opportunities. Along with what we're really emphasizing here, this is sort of a parenthetical point. What we're really emphasizing here, what we're primarily emphasizing here, is the proper way of saying it, is the embeddedness of the infinity of Hashem, specifically in Eretz Yisrael, as an access point to the infinity of Hashem. Even though, of course, Hashem's infinity is unlimited, that's sort of self-evident, it's more naturally accessible in Eretz Yisrael. For example, the Gemara tells us that simply the atmosphere in Eretz Yisrael makes a person mischachem, again, chachma, because they become aligned with that infinity that is embedded within their identity.
What was the word? It makes them
Mischachem, mem taf, chaf ches mem, makes them chachamish, wiser, something in that genre. Okay.
Thank you.
Kiyadua, like we know. I'm sorry, I skipped a phrase there. I'm sorry, I was on the wrong page there. Whoops. And he is called Or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the infinite light of Hashem. The aspect of Hashem allows him, because it's infinite, to bring a new and more powerful level of himself into the world each year, progressively, and demonstrates that this is his essential ratzon. And that's the core point, that from the beginning of the year to the next year. And what happens the next year? It's got to be at a whole different level. And this is really what the Alter Rebbe is appealing to, a theme that we have seen before. Rabbi Tzvi Freeman, who does a lot of writing for Chabad.org, describes in his own personal journey of coming connected to Kedusha that he came to realize, and he says it this way, which I think is clever. He says, you don't conform to the Rebbe, you try and keep up, which I think really captures it well. Meaning he's a young teenager, full of energy, radical, change the world kind of thing. And somehow he stumbles on Chabad. And he looks at this rabbi in Brooklyn who's 80 years old, and he thinks, come on, I'm a young, athletic, vibrant guy. And just physically, he can't even keep up with the Rebbe's schedule. And and said, and again, the way he describes it, and I think it's clever and it's relevant to the point here. It's like there's two ways of appealing to people, generally, oversimplification. One is, we'll make it easy on you. See, it's not so hard. It's not so hard to do Torah and mitzvahs. And if it's really hard, we'll make it even easier. We'll make a little compromise here, and we'll make a little less insistence there. And we'll tell you, well, you don't have to keep kosher all the time. Just keep kosher at home. And it's not like you could never do it. And that was a strategy. And again, it's easy for me to sit here and go, we knew that. But at the time, that seemed like a reasonable strategy. You're not going to get, quote unquote, spoiled American couch potatoes to bypass all the delicious restaurants and walk in the rain to shul and so on. So let's make it easier for them. That was a strategy. And again, it's easy for me to criticize it and so on. But you could always make it easier and easier and easier. You can always water down the soup and water down the soup and water down the soup. And the Rebbe's mentality was strategy, if we could use that term, was we're going to challenge you to keep up. Let's see how fast you can run. You can run even faster and faster and faster. And so we became more insistent and more particular in every nuance and halacha and so on. Yes, the grandmother of the bride.
Yeah, the grandmother bride. Thank you. I don't know exactly. It may not be a good question to ask, but it just keeps coming up in my head. Okay. If there is all of the, so much of this infinity of Hashem and is in Eretz Israel and all that, why doesn't it spill over to the other guys? I mean, why do we, seriously, if it's there, they can't get it because they're not Jewish. I mean, what is this
Well,
horrible?
I'll say a few responses to that. I think it's actually a very good and important question. On the one hand, the Rebbe says, look, every nation in the world, every culture in the world knows that when you say the Holy Land, you mean Israel. Even the people who have everybody, when you say everybody, it's always an overgeneralization, understands that the Holy Land is Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
Why is it that the whole world is fighting over this land, which is like 2 centimeters? People are all familiar with everything going on in Eretz Yisrael. How familiar are they with what's going on in Finland and Norway and Thailand and Taiwan and so on? Almost not at all. All these people out protesting occupation. What do they say about China wanting to annex Taiwan? Oh, I didn't know about that. Why do they know so much about it? Because everybody, and again, saying everybody, recognizes that it's the Holy Land. So whenever there's an opportunity for great holiness, there's an opportunity for an abuse of that holiness. I mean, right. Every time there's an opportunity for something godly, there's an opportunity to abuse that godliness and to harm that level of godliness. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, on the upside,
that's why Hani needs somebody with her for a week too, right?
Yeah, same idea. Exactly. Right. There's a great Kedusha. Okay. So that great Kedusha is vulnerable. Right. It's vulnerable to being hijacked away from it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
You got it. Okay. So it's called Or Ein Sof, the light that has no end, Baruch Hu, Ein Sof. It does not end. It doesn't run out somewhere. Vein Ketz, and there's no edge where we say, okay, we've now achieved the objective and we no longer need to hold on to that any longer. Lamaila. So it's not like it serves a purpose in order to get something else out of it. The Gdulas Ha'or, the expanse, the word Gedulas probably translates as large or big, but in our context, it's the word for infinite. V'achayis, and the life force, hanimshach mimenu, that is being drawn out from this level of godliness, yisbarech michachmasai, and again, we keep on coming to this level, the chachma level. And again, Chachma meaning the infinity of Hashem. To spiritualize the relationship, to use that term. We spiritualize the relationship. Eloi acher Eloi, higher and higher. That is a constant, closer and closer. It might be a more applicable term. What do I mean by higher? Meaning become closer and closer, a more and more intense level of closeness with Hashem. Ad ein ketz v'tachlis, not because we want to get somewhere and then be done. And that's ultimately the point. There's the old joke about the guy, the first time he shows up in Eretz Yisrael, and of course he runs to the kotel and he wants to daven, so he instinctively asks, which way is east? What do you mean? This is east. This is it. This is, you have arrived. This is not a test. This is it. You have come to this moment. To those who have been blessed to marry off a child, and you come to the wedding, and you've been to this same hall 100 times, and you look around and you go, hey, I know all these people. Oh, right, this is my kid's wedding. You know, you're used to being there, and you know some people, and you don't know some people. And you look around, right, this is it. You know, they say, you know, this is my in-laws, and it's you. Like, that's me, right? You have arrived. So this is what we mean with Eretz Yisrael. It is that level where it isn't now and when is, this is it. This is that it moment. L'roim ha'mailas l'mayla mayla. That we have reached, again, the translation is to the highest of the high. But again, high, low, I don't know if that really captures it. I would use the word, and again, if you could think of a better word, it's like a closer and closer relationship with the infinity of Hashem. A deeper and deeper, more meaningful relationship with this connected sense with Hashem. A more and more intense level of closeness with Hashem. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. So again, we'll finish next week, but to go back to sort of reset the table. The goal of this letter is for the Alter Rebbe to inspire the people to reach into their relationship with Eretz Yisrael, and thus to understand their opportunity to be connected with the infinity of Eretz Yisrael. And that the distinctive quality of Eretz Yisrael is not the topography, and it's not even the history. It's that innately contained within this land is where Hashem's, quote, whole purpose, or primary purpose is embedded within it, as indicated by the idea of Chachma. And again, Chachma meaning the infinity, the expanse, the opportunity to be connected with the infinite characteristic of Hashem, which allows, even if I am, and everybody's got their spiritual personality, a kind of very left side, I like order, I like persistence, and so on, I can connect with Chachma. From a very right side, I like artistic, sort of imaginative, creative, I can connect with Chachma. And by connecting ourselves with Eretz Yisrael, we become connected with the embedding of Chachma into this physical world as an opportunity for us to become connected with Hashem. And then we'll get next week into that pasuk where we talk about why there needs to be a renewal of that, or even better, it's not even a renewal. That's not even the right word, because renewal suggests that it's the same thing. There needs to be an advance every year, and then we'll get onto that nuance about why, quote, the aleph is missing from that word, gracious. Okay, we'll stop.